Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Ike Baker, what the fuck is up? Arcanvm podcast, author, occultist, magician. I don't know if you. I like sorcerer. I've been playing with sorcerer for myself, but I'll let you. I'll let you say what you want to say about yourself, Ike. And it is a huge honor to have you on my show. And it's not about like show size, but it's also about like people who are really networked in the community, like quote unquote occult community, and just being able to sort of like navigate all the different currents and systems and personalities and all of that. So I have a huge amount of respect for you. As you know, I don't pretend to know anything about Hellenic anything, but I know you do. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and then sort of wherever you want to take us. I'm game. Thank you so much, Ike. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be here. And thank you for having me on. Thanks for asking. Sorcerer, not so much for me. It's a cool term, right? I mean, I listen to a lot of music that applied those aesthetics and those terms, you know, wizards, sorcery, and things like that. But I would call myself mainly I would consider myself an adept of the Golden Dawn, because I am. You know, it's that term adept gets it too much play. It's overused. And when you first are asked, or you first petition and then are, you know, hopefully accepted into the second or inner order of the Golden Dawn, they basically tell you, look, we're going to let you call yourself an adept because you're an adept of the outer order. And we're going to let you kind of play around with that until you earn that title. So I would say for the Golden Dawn, you know, I'm an initiate, I'm an adept, I'm an administrator, a teacher in that lineage. I run the Asheville, North Carolina Temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is the North Carolina temple and maybe like I would say even you know, mid-East Coast temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn under the Ciceros. I mean, I try to do it. I try to follow what I'm interested in. And I've learned how I work. Even as a kid, I would have a notebook open. I would have a coloring book open. I would have whatever, you know, army toys or whatever's going on. And I just kind of go from thing to thing and, you know, maybe half finish everything. Well, as an adult, I learned how to do that and finish everything. So that has led me into territories like alchemy and astrology. I mean, obviously, you know, any magician has to be an astrologer. It doesn't mean that you have to do it professionally or that you even have to read charts for people, but certainly you must be an astrologer in order to be a magician. I would say that's true in the Eastern and Western traditions. I just kind of ended up falling into a lot of this stuff, joining a lot of esoteric orders. Not at first. I spent around, I don't know, maybe like 8 to 10 years just doing the Golden Dawn. And then I got really involved in other stuff, Martinism, Freemasonry, so on and so forth. There's a whole litany of them. Really, when I moved to Asheville, really, I initially I was brought up through the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in New York. Moved to Asheville, I jokingly say that it became Sashville because there was just this incredible access all of a sudden to this what is essentially a subculture, an underground world that coexists with the rest of humanity, but is little suspected. It's actually not that dissimilar from the little wizarding world of Harry Potter. It's there, but it's way below the surface. So yeah, I would I consider myself certainly a ceremonial magician in the Western tradition. And then, I started out with Zazen meditation, and I went to school for Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and herbalism, traditional Chinese medicine. So I have a lot of schooling in a very specific niche within the Eastern tradition. But ultimately, I was never trained magically in that system. I was trained magically in the Western system via the Golden Dawn and other things.
Well, so that was great. Thank you, Ike. I appreciate that you kind of took my goading a little bit to introduce yourself and give yourself like the framing that you prefer. So I appreciate that. Thank you. But I also want to say about the astrology thing. So we did discourse about this quite extensively when you came on Rejects the second time and with Jamie. And I totally agree with you. You have to understand to a degree planetary magic and like the star at least for Tantra, you have to understand also the star matches and lunar matches and all that stuff. It's just that we use such a different system. So I hesitate to ever call myself an astrologer. It's not that it's so different from Sefer Yetzirah. It's not that different from that. It's more similar to that than anything.
Yeah.
But it has a different like cosmological and ontological view that seems very unfamiliar to a lot of people. I'm not just talking about Western magicians. I'm talking about like Western Buddhists even. There's a sort of different there's a different understanding. There's a secret understanding. I'm not saying I'm like the deepest density or the deepest core of that understanding, but I have experience enough in the system that reading those sort of astrological treaties, I understand them in a different way, in a more Sambodhi Gaia way, which is a more Twilight language way. So it's more conceptual rather than materially real. Now, I understand this is not perfect, especially probably for you who prefers like a very materialist, which is I agree with, a more materialist orientation to like magic that gets results, not just speculative ideas, but also like actual formulations. It's just that we address the astrological conditions with ontological tools. So it's very difficult to then like go on a show and be like, oh, I'm an astrologer, because my knowledge is not comparable, and it's not even it's not I feel relatively inferior, to be honest. So it's not out of like haughtiness or anything that I say I'm not an astrologer. I'm really not an astrologer, but yes, you're right. I do understand to a degree astrological conditions, and I can relate them to the Hebrew Kabbalah.
Yeah, and because the key thing there is relationship. For anybody that's listening, might not be familiar, though I do presuppose quite a bit of knowledge on the part of the listener, but just in case, the Sefer Yetzirah boils the cosmological forces of the universe into the 22, boils it down into the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And this is divided into a 3, a 7, and a 12. Okay, the 3 elements, 7 visible planets, the 12 signs of the zodiac. Okay, 3 mother letters, 7 double letters, 12 simple letters. And it's all about relationship. It's how they interact with each other. As I said, magic doesn't require you to read charts, but I would say that first of all, it's just particularly in the Western tradition, I would say there's an emphasis on it because of thoroughness and intimacy, meaning how intimate you understand and you know the relationships between these things, because that will serve you cosmologically, psychologically, mythologically. You'll learn how to reduce everything down to its essentials, and understand the symbols as just kind of specific ways of approaching these things, which we can, it would require us to speak in very abstract terms in order to talk about these things in any way that approaches even doing so directly, and that's a huge part of teaching magic, is training people to understand symbols as essentials, as representative or expressive in some way of a concept, of an idea, of a relationship. Because after all, I mean, anything we do in the physical cosmos, and that's and that is kind of the point, of magic is to work in the physical cosmos. Now that physical cosmos, and let's say we boil it down into 22 forces or powers, right? That's going to be also in us. Okay, that's we are a microcosmos, right? A little universe. So we are the microcosm. So to understand and to be able to start working with those powers in some way, and be inward directed, that's the beginning of that transformation that eventually will lead somebody to being a magician. But I would say the best, safest course, whether east or west, is to be initiated, and to have, or at the very least to have, if you can't join an esoteric order or something, to have a mentor, have a teacher, have somebody that has, with some kind of pedigree, that has walked the path before you.
I think this is a really interesting idea. Obviously, I'm a tantric Buddhist. Everybody who listens to the show knows, or rejects. So obviously lineage is important, but I'm just going to tell you I'm going to be honest with you, Ike, as like I'm moving more into the post-magical sort of idea of what I think American magic could be. Not what American magic is, but what American magic could be. And I think it's a lot more psychic or psionic, or this kind of like, but I think Tantra also can be translated into this. So I mean, everything that we do is internal alchemy. Everything from like even the, ritual performance that people would understand as what I would call Kriya Tantra. So like puja and homas, well, homa is a little higher yoga, but anyways, the fire offering and all that stuff, like all the things that you would learn. That's also, you can also perform it in the mind palace, basically. So you learn the outer performance so you can then perform it in the inner world. And the inner world is obviously in your own mind. And of course, there's a little bit outside of it. And maybe that's a secret layer, is to like how to externalize it or materialize it in the more fluid reality outside your mind. But I mean, that's pretty much what it is. So it is exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I understand, maybe not to a high degree, but to a relative degree, I do understand like the functions of ceremonial magic and Western esotericism. Of course, I grew up Catholic. Like, I mean, I grew up in a very syncretic and multiracial household, but yeah, I understand Catholicism to a high degree. I come from a family that deeply believed in the saints and sort of the Marian apparitions, especially like the French Canadian ones. We have quite a few of them actually, like organic ones from Quebec and on the prairies. And so, if you're French Canadian, you have like a very strong devotion to specific French Canadian saints. So, this is like just the story of also my family and just like the ecstatic or sort of magical thinking, the idea of like in the US, you have Tijan, or they call him like High John sometimes in the South. Well, we have Tijan as well. And so he's depicted a little differently. Sometimes he's given sometimes they'll use the icon of St. John the Baptist as a little kid wearing the hair shirt. And sometimes he'll be like a 7 foot tall lumberjack with red hair. So it depends. Or sometimes he'll be a little native guy with a big wang. I'm not trying to be funny, but that is how it's depicted. So what I'm saying is that there are these kind of mythomagical archetypes or mythopoetic archetypes that I'm very familiar with and comfortable with from Western culture, relatively. So it's not totally foreign to me. It's just that the diaspora that I come from, even though I'm mixed, they consider us Asian. So my whole life it's like been told like, oh yeah, you're just Asian, like this is who you are. You're just like you're Indo-Eurasian, like that's your identity. So for me, I was always like, oh, I'm Asian. So it made more sense to me to look at things from that perspective. But the older I've become, the more I've actually realized maybe I'm really just American. Like I'm not really tied in with my diaspora, or like I'm not saying I'm anti. I speak Mandarin, I speak Bahasa. I'm just saying that I'm not. Maybe that's not who I am. Maybe
Right.
I'm like more expansive. That's all. So that's sort of where I come from it.
Yeah.
Is like a realization that maybe I should synthesize more readily, more cautious, more carefully.
Yeah, I think it's good to start with your root system, though. I truly do. There are many ways to approach it. Because I know that not that she's the final word on it, but certainly I consider her a teacher from beyond the grave. It was a big thing for Dion Fortune. Was people would come to her and ask what part of the path did she recommend, and because she had the fraternity of the inner light, which became the society of the inner light. So she had a whole group of acolytes and things of this nature. And she was big in telling people, look, if you have Nordic blood, ethnicity, go there, practice magic there, work with that pantheon, work with those traditions. She was very much into are you Middle Eastern? Go there, work with that stuff. I think that it's a really good way in to connect with our roots and then come forward, because in magic, everyone and in all this stuff, everybody's kind of just using everything or appropriating everything. There's no quintessential American magic. We're borrowing from the Middle Ages and Renaissance Italy, the British Isles, all over the place. We're taking from ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt. We're bringing all this stuff together. And so I think it's good to find your way in and establish, I mean, obviously I'm Greek. My mother's family is from Sicily. So there's all sorts of interesting connections to the Levant and the Near East by way of Sicily and of Greece too. So I have, that's where I'm at. I study the Hellenic stuff and the Hellenistic stuff, because the Hellenistic stuff was, at the time of Alexander, and then the Greco-Egyptian Roman period. I mean, it spread everywhere in Syria, Phoenicia, Egypt, Athens, Magna Graecia, right, mainland Italy, and things like this. So it was a Mediterranean culture, and I really ethnically I identify with that lineage, that ancestry. But I tell people all the time when they ask me, like, you know, well, what nationality are you? What do you mean? What nationality am I? I'm American. You know, you know, I was, what are you? Where are you from? I'm from New York. I'm from, you know, I'm not, you don't want to know where my dad is from? You know, okay, yeah, he's from Greece. You know, I was born in Queens. You know, so I definitely see that. You know, you have to tie all this stuff back to what you are and where you are and when you are. Okay, you have to tie that back. Josephine McCarthy, another great magician. She worked for several years in the United States, I believe, in as an exorcist. And some of the things that she did was exorcise land, which is a really brilliant technique that I borrow from her. I learned, you know, from her work and things of this nature. And she says, she remarks in one of her books, I think it might be The Exorcist's Handbook, maybe another one. But she says, she makes a point like, you know, Americans are always, they're chasing the Greek pantheon and and I'm paraphrasing now, but they're obsessed with the Greek pantheon, the Celtic pantheon, this kind of stuff. When they have a built-in magical interface, a symbol system, you know, a magical vocabulary that is already hardwired to the land they live on, but it's Native American. And so they're, you know, yeah, you could get interested in that level of history, but then, you know, it's virtually, it's highly improbable that somebody like me, you know, by all accounts, a white man with Mediterranean ancestry from New York is going to be brought in and initiated, you know, into those traditions. But I certainly think that it is worth understanding that stuff. You know, Lakota tribe is some of the most interesting and readily available through the work of something like Black Elk Speaks that people can look to. And I mean, certainly that text itself is just brimming with insights that even relate very much to the things that were being reported and the philosophies being expounded by the you know, Neoplatonic and Hermetic traditions of antiquity too, and you know, on the other side of the world. So I think, you know, it's good as an entry point. I think really good to connect with those roots, but you got to bring it forward, right? You can't stay there and cosplay as, you know, I am a priest of Hecate and all this stuff. Yeah, yes, sure, but you're also a barista in Starbucks. You know, you're also, it's like, yes, and you know, so you've got to merge these two things into a third thing. You know, the reality of mundane existence and the reality of your magical existence.
I completely agree. So I think you did touch on what I think American magic is, which is Josephine McCarthy. Like I don't know her work or her system or anything, so I'm not trying to copy her stuff. But geontological relations, that there is an embedded relationality, a treaty, a kinship, like a familiar relationship. Maybe it's in what they would call right relation. Maybe it's in bad relation. Maybe there is no relation. It's at neutral. So how do you forge one? Well, the truth is, Ike, is that Tibetan Buddhism does actually offer a lot of this very similar. I'm not saying it's the same, but there's a lot of very similar cultural technologies like cedar tips. So obviously, I live in Canada. We have a lot of Indigenous people here. The majority are Cree, Algonquin speaking. That spans from, interestingly, all the way from the shores of the Hudson Bay, where where the whole Greenland thing is happening right now, and all the way to the very far reaches of Western BC, British Columbia. So it's about 1 million people. They don't all speak that language, but it's the most, second to only Navajo. Their system is relatively well documented, if not well preserved, but most Canadians have a relatively high degree of familiarity with a lot of Indigenous ideas, especially. Well, we have a lot of mixed race people. We have the whole Indigenous people called Métis people, who obviously have Cree and Ojibwe ancestry, and French Canadian or Scottish as well. So there's actually a famous Canadian philosopher who was married to a governor general, and he posited actually that Canada was a Métis nation, very similar to some of the thinking on like the American Constitution, and how it was informed by like the, you know, like the five civilized tribes, and also but also by like the Seneca, the Oneida, the Mohawk, etc., like the gatekeepers of what they actually call themselves. So there is Mithraic elements, you could say, like with treaty making, and with obviously indigenous people have secret societies. So this is no surprise. Like Metaweewin, the medicine societies, this is pretty much pan-Indian. And there's also the idea of like the French and Scottish Masonic rite. It's definitely well embedded in Métis culture. If you look at a Métis flag, it is the infinity symbol on a blue flag. If you go into Métis churches in the prairies, it's, even from my outer perspective, it is so clear. It's so clearly there. And Rosicrucian elements as well. So I mean, it's and you know, Métis people controlled the glass bead culture. Actually, the trading started from Métis people. So a lot of the iconography that was used, like by the Dakotas, like you were talking about, or by the Lakotas, or the Siouan nations, we'll say, I'll just say more broadly, because I know people get very aggro about that. But the Métis people actually influenced all the cultural objects that were utilized on their sort of like clothing, beadwork, all of it. So you will see a lot of, I would say, French Rosicrucian elements because of that influence. Like you'll see, like they're not just using indigenous plants, they're using specific European. I know you like the metaphor of the rose. It's one of the best Kabbalistic metaphors, maybe best metaphors for the entire universe. But yeah, you'll see like them use very European kind of roses. You'll see specific Kabbalistic colors. You'll clearly see sort of ideas of like the light passing through glass. So there's clearly a system of signs and symbols, but as you're saying, it's not well preserved. And even in indigenous culture itself, it's very reconstructionist. Now that's not necessarily bad, of course. Most things are. But I think there's also the idea of like this true primordial system. So this is a very Buddhist thing, Ike, is that we would say there's one primordial truth, but most things are relative. And what is the primordial truth? It is the word arising from the space of emptiness. Now, I differ from Greg. I know I like Greg a lot. I consider him like my Dharma brother, and obviously he's been on the show. But I differ from him in my understanding of emptiness. He would call it void or nothingness. And I would say that emptiness is actually luminousness and massless and contained in the infinite space of love. To me, that is a very Rime, which is my sect of Buddhism, that is a very Rime way to understand sort of what the universe really is, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
That more primordial truth. So
I mean, that's very, there's a lot of, you know, it's strong parallels and connections to the Hermetic and Neoplatonic stuff in the Hellenistic tradition, particularly coming out of, you know, that Pythagoreanism of, you know, Southern Europe and the Mediterranean there, this idea that there is a one from which everything ultimately descends. But that one is not, it has to be unified. Otherwise, it cannot be the one. If you've arrived someplace and the one, you can say anything about it, means it's not unified because it's not everything. This was an intuition. And so therefore it's not the one. You're not there yet. But this was an intuition, or really a discursive way of approaching a reality that cannot truly be put into words. But I think I you know, obviously the word arising from the emptiness is extremely, I would say that's extremely Platonic and Neoplatonic. Thing is that, yeah, they had a different idea of emptiness rather than it being void. And this comes to them from the Neoplatonic and Neo-Pythagorean traditions, which come a little later, right? The last few centuries BCE, the first few centuries CE or AD, whatever you like, Comes from Parmenides of Elea, was the major philosopher who discussed being and non-being. He basically decides, like, look, he comes to the conclusion non-being can't exist. Non-being cannot exist because that means that there is creation ex nihilo, which can't happen. Not logically. And not only that, but just because a person dies, is it the end of people? Or if you want to use the Aristotelian thing where we're talking about genera, species, difference, accident, all that kind of the way that you kind of analyze and then synthesize to get to the main thing, the universal component. If a mammal dies, is that the end of mammals? If if you run out of carrots in your fridge, does it mean carrots don't exist anywhere? If North America runs out of carrots or apple, does that mean it's there? No. There's no proof that non-being actually exists as a thing. So they start from this idea of the one rather than the zero, but they have to account for the one, which is what, they have to kind of account for the zero. They have to kind of, and so they refer to it as the one which is not, but always starting from one. And, issuing forth from that one is logos, order, reason, and also I'm translating it now in its various translations, order, reason, and also word, which arises. And word is what? Word is the expression of the contents of mind. If I don't have words to tell you what I'm thinking, you won't know, unless I draw it out or something like that. So, but this was the ancient way of talking about what is the word. And you can get into all sorts of details like, well, it was vibration. Sure. But at the end of the day, if we're looking at it at the ancient worldview, I think the most salient and comprehensive way to interpret that is that there was intelligence, there was relationship and recognition between all things. Even let's say, if we want to reduce it scientifically down to material particles, right? Microparticles, and atoms, and molecules. And if there's no inherent law, if there's no inherent reason, and these particles have no reason to adhere or be repelled from each other. You take the idea, right? The theory of the Big Bang. The fact is, if the Big Bang happens, within the nothing, meaning no space, there's no space. A lot of people close their eyes and they imagine the Big Bang happening, but they're already imagining space. There's just nothing in it. It's void. That's not. There's no space before the Big Bang, so there's no space for any of this to happen in. The Big Bang happens, and let's say all these particles fly out, and they would just reach their logical conclusion. Nothing would adhere if there were no underlying reason to bring, I don't know, carbon and hydrogen or helium or some sort of, I'm not a scientist, but there would be no reason for these things to adhere. You can't just call that chance. Doesn't make any fucking sense, to be honest with you. It's more of a leap of faith believing that than believing that an infinite mind, we are contained within its dream, is a much more reasonable thing to think. But they start with the one in this principle, and it is something that is so completely everything, past, present, future, all possibility, everything. It is so everything all at once that it is effectively nothing, right? Because it's no thing. It's no single thing. And so the big thing to distinguish here, particularly in the Neoplatonic and Neo-Pythagorean and Hermetic traditions, is that how can something be everything and nothing at the same time? Well, we have this idea of things within the context of, space and time as discrete objects. Okay. But what would be required of something that was so much of everything, it was effectively nothing, an empty plenitude, an empty fullness that you come to understand time at a more sophisticated level and grasp its philosophical capital R reality, which is that it's a construct. It doesn't actually exist. It is, linear time. The way we experience it is not. We don't observe it the way it actually is. It's not a reality. Time needs space. Why? Because things change. I was over there. I am over here. The leaves were on the trees, then they fell. They're off the trees, so on and so forth. It's a way that human beings and phenomenal creatures recognize change. So everything that would, all the discrete sort of manifestations of things, all of these things becoming unified requires that they exist outside of time and space, which reorients our ideas to the eternal. A lot of people think of like dwelling in eternity as just living forever, as eternity is like linear time ad infinitum. That's not actually the state. And especially if you've reached these kind of more henostic, samadhi-like experiences, you realize that there's no time but now, and it's ever present. And so this is what you tap into. Eternity is not a really, 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 really long, endless span of linear time. It's completely outside of time, completely outside of space. It is a mode of being and understanding which is so unfathomably unfamiliar and uncognizable to the finitude of our human minds, and the constraints that have been placed on the soul while in incarnation, that we must refer to this as apophatically, meaning which is to speak of it in the negatives. Okay, you talk about eternity, we talk about eternity as infinity, right? So you say the divine, the Godhead, is infinite. You're not saying anything positive about it. You're saying it's not finite. So this is the way of referring to things. And you see it in the Buddhist, in the Pali canons and things like this, when they say things like, anatma, doesn't mean that there's no self. It just means that anything, you can't really attribute anything materially to the soul, to the self. The glasses, the blue blockers are not the self. The emerald ring's not the self. The, this funny little globe, that's not the self. The beard is not the self. The opinions are not the self. So on and so forth. A bit of a tangent there, but it's you got me really excited about that kind of stuff, because it is such a huge part of the Neoplatonic tradition and the Hermetic traditions, and a huge part of what I do. Because I'm not like, the reason why did I distinguish myself away from sorcery? It's not because I'm better or I'm higher than, or because I belong to this thing. I don't do manifestation magic. I don't do magic to make the fucking weather change. I don't do magic to get money. I don't do magic to get things I want. I do theurgic magic, which is, theurgy is the application of the techniques and technologies of magic to the evolution of the soul, the development of the soul. So I'm actually much more interested in these internal states. And I would even say that theurgic magic across millennia has always involved a contemplative aspect, a psychic aspect, a mystical aspect. Or the same can't necessarily be true about mysticism. They don't necessarily have to have, you don't have to have this complex ceremonial and theoretic behind your interface with the divine. But I would say that really, if you are the type of person that's wants to go down the path, the trajectory of theurgic magic, you will need a mystical, psychic, contemplative practice. And this is where all this stuff comes into play, because really, I prefer to, rather than talk about it being in your head, I prefer it to be just, everything is a particular manifestation of consciousness. Even magic, right? The way, and I'll end on this. There's a lot of definitions for magic that have been thrown out there. Some are very popular by Crowley, et cetera, so on and so forth. But I've kind of given it new wording based on, modern terminology and what the modern person feels more satisfied with. I guess the traditional way would be saying, according to somebody like Crowley, magic is the ability to make changes occur in conformity to the will. You can say that about anything. I want to move my car out of the driveway. I made a change conforming to my will. That's, and to a degree, yeah, everything is magical. But I would say magic, as we are trying to understand it, trying to work with it, is probably better or more precisely defined as where, or the intersection point between the phenomenology of consciousness and metaphysical causality, where they meet and interact with each other.
So for a Buddhist, like, this is very easy. It's like all cause is desire.
Precisely.
And the world is non-dual. So yes, it's real and not real at the same time. I know this is very unsatisfactory for many, but this is how I think of it personally as well. So I agree that it's what you make of it right now. And I always say, like, it's consciousness. That's also the word I prefer to use, is consciousness. I will disagree with you, however, and say this is not my disagreement per se, but maybe just a systemic one, is that we do like the magic number 10 and 11 both. So we would have room for both of those, but we also like the 7 is extremely important. The 9 is extremely important. The 5 is extremely important. Maybe the second most important number is the 5. And then the 6, which would be the sun consciousness, what we call like the Kumara. So it's interesting that there are even parallels in that. And you were also talking about like demarcations of time. Well, obviously we relate this story in Tantra as time arises as 9. So Kala Bhairava, or Mahakala, the time king, he arises in 8 forms. So he takes place in the sun, the moon, space, fire, earth, water, death. But anyways, the point is like he takes manifestation into 8 different forms, with the 9th being time. So of course you can say that time, as you said, arises in the mind, because what is he? He is cosmic time, but we have to understand what that even is. So if we cannot understand what that is, we cannot understand like the bina in our own consciousness of what cosmic time is, like outside of the supernal, outside of the the 7 luminaries, then how can we really relate it? So we would say that space is infinite, like you also kind of, I think you said it that. I don't know if it's equivalent, but yeah, we would say space is infinite. That's the female principle. That would be the 0. We sometimes use negation to describe her. One of the first goddesses I ever learned was called Niraitmia, whose name means she without fixed self. But in older scholarship, they actually would translate it as she without self. But actually, the way that they've sort of updated and modernized the translation from Sanskrit now to she without fixed self actually makes a lot more sense if you know the actual practice, which is that she is envisioned, or is generated, as what we would call it, as Quicksilver. Her consort, who is a male consort, is also generated in the idea of Quicksilver. He is the color of lapis lazuli, and she is the color of turquoise. So it's waking and sleeping mind, wisdom and method, bina, hokmah, brought together in synthesis, yab yum, consort yoga. But it doesn't necessarily obviously mean even sex. It has nothing even to do with that, perhaps, at the more inner and secret layers. But maybe it does, but usually it doesn't. So that's how we would resolve. We would say the consort resolves all paradox. So basically that's how we think of it. It's like we prefer the dyad. We can live with a monad, but we also don't have a creator deity. Like we don't have like one specific source. It's like time is nonlinear. So there's universal moments of creation, destruction, pralaya, and the interstitial period in between that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, particularly concerning, what they call the theology of arithmetic and the nature of number, which is very, very important to Hermetic and Neoplatonic, Neo-Pythagorean cosmogony and cosmology. I wouldn't say that the feminine principle is the 0. I find that, well, to my point earlier, is that eternity, infinity is completely outside of time. And because the two are related, completely outside of space. So there is no space. So I would say that it's not so much that space is infinite for, in my conception, so much as that when you reach a certain point outside of phenomenality, beyond the dyad, time is obliterated and space is obliterated. There is no time, there is no space. This is very, very difficult for somebody to think about. My buddy a good friend of mine growing up, we'd get stoned and he'd be like, man, do you ever think about like the second before everything happened? Like the Big Bang, like right before, just the second before that happened. And he would tell me about how it would drive him nuts. And so I tried it one night, not altered in any way, and I can't do it. My mind is so conditioned to thinking about everything here, space is and time, and there's no way I can think of nothing. There's no mind meditation, but even there, that's when you get to the core of things. There is being. Being does not require, right? In a metaphysical concept, materialists would disagree. Being does not require space or time. Right. For me and for, the Western tradition as a whole, consciousness is not an emergent property of your neurology. It's not emergent from the organ of the brain. It's independent. We look at things differently. We think now in modern days, it's kind of turned the ancient world on its head, no pun intended, but we think that consciousness is a product of matter. Right, because your brain is matter. Well, the ancient worldview is that matter is a product of consciousness that it then slips into, and that embodies the feminine principle. But I would say that the way that we conceive of it numerologically, which is quite significant, we view number as sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's in the Neo-Pythagorean tradition, they call this the addition of the monad, meaning you just keep adding 1. And you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. But there's this idea that in its, right, like I mentioned before, it's capital R reality, it's philosophical reality. It doesn't start with one number. It starts with the decad or the Pythagorean tetractys, meaning all 10 numbers are there already. The decad, the 10 itself, is a kind of monad, and they call it the nature of number. And so, like you're saying, it becomes less about priority of the one, and it becomes relationship of the 1 to the 2, the 3 to the 7, the 4 to the 10, so on and so forth. And it's kind of to my point earlier, this idea of relationship. Now, the last point I will end on this point. If you're familiar with Kabbalism, particularly in, I would say, the Hermetic Kabbalism of something like the Golden Dawn, Dion Fortune, so on and so forth, they have this idea of the lightning flash. Okay, so you have the 10 Sphirot arranged on the tree of life. For anybody that's not familiar, just go look at it. You have the 10 Sphirot, right? The spheres, the vessels, the circles on that diagram. And they are generated in a sequence, or at least enumerated by their hierarchy, the hierarchy of relationship, by a lightning flash. Why by a lightning flash? Well, not just because of the figure it makes when you draw lines going from top to bottom, but because a lightning flash happens, it appears to happen instantaneously. And so these, in something particularly like Hermetic Kabbalism, we would say that the 10 Sphirot, the emanations, actually all happen at once. And the reason there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that linear kind of verticality, is because there are hierarchical dynamics. There are relationships to this whole that appear sequential when really they are all coterminous and happening at the same time and in the same space. So I've always thought that that's really interesting, especially because it forces you to sort of reprioritize certain ways of thinking about time and certain ways of thinking about the validity of different spiritual systems, right? I mean, it's like, okay, I do believe that there is one truth, and that truth is the one. But I think some people are on maybe a 4 path to getting there, a 3 path, a 2 path, a 7 path. So we don't all have to be on the same paths. But again, yes, it's all kind of directed towards the one. So yeah, I mean, just a few points of interest there to riff on what you brought to the table.
Sure. Thanks, Ike. I wrote a couple notes down.
Awesome.
So sorcery, I didn't address this last time. I am not a sorcerer in the, I guess, popular occult meaning of that word. What I mean is that I utilize specific ritual technologies, but for Theurgic purposes, which is basically that's all Tantra really is. So it's kind of was a tongue-in-cheek joke. But I agree with you. Do Theurgy, the results will be much more profound. I wanted to point at the idea of the time and the time king and time and space and being outside time and space. So we would say that Mahakala is not the primary mandala deity. He is not the one inherently. So he gets destroyed along the way, basically, because obviously Buddhism, our gods are empty. Basically, you could think of it like that. So they self-combust like a star. Like you could think of that like a self-combusting star. So he gets destroyed by the Upasaka's own mind, because who is the Mahakala? Mahakala is really as you said, our own conceptualization of the 3 kinds of time. So basically, once you've annihilated those things, then you can move on in the mandala. So maybe that's an interesting difference or similarity. So I agree with you about the lightning flash. Yes, all the Sephira are activated at one time. That is the lightning flash. I 100% am with you. However, we do think of the Shakti as both chthonic and spatial at the same time, because we think of it as that she falls down. So if you want to think of it, there's a primordial dyad. The Shakti looks over her left shoulder. This is exactly how it's described. She hears the cries of reality, or she's curious. It depends on the story. So she looks over her left shoulder. She falls down into material reality, becomes the primordial Barbello, this ferocious, Pleiadian grandmother. She's a werewolf goddess in Tibet. People love when I say that, so I'll give that. She is the head of a werewolf, but sometimes she rides a bear. She's very primordial. She represents Polaris, or the North Star. So she basically wants to escape all creation. So that is in her chthonic form. Although Buddhism posits that she actually gets conquered, tamed, and brought into Dharma. So that's how we would think of it, using our kind of sorcery. So there was a 6th century figure who was a magician, the sorcerer of the highest order of Buddha. People would say of the Nirmankaya body, so the earthly body, but he represents a higher order Buddha. But he came into an earthly body and he subjugated this ferocious werewolf queen. And so by subjugating her, he's actually opened a way, a relationship to subjugate all the Dakinis, all the sky witches, all the vampires, all the the women, and also the male gods, but particularly because she's the primordial one, but she's also 0. So that's really important for us, is that we do think of it as that. But she can climb up as the Scarlet Woman. We call it Vajrayogini or Narokachari, but she can climb up the tree as well. That's also how it's conceptualized. She starts on the carnal ground and then she climbs up to the higher order as you take away aggregations. So you didn't call them this exact word. You didn't say like aggregations of the mind, but that is how we would say. It's like to get back to Diamond Thunder, which is more the way we would describe it instead of just thunder or lightning. We would say that the more things, the more conceptualizations, the more identities that you kind of flay away. That's even how Tantra would describe it. Like they would have the flaying knife and you'd flay away those things conceptually, of course, but you conceptually take those things away until you have what is left. And so we would say the what is left is massless, luminous, and infinite, and full of love. And so that would take you all the way up the tree. So we say that she can get there too, and she can also be free of aggregates. But when she's in her chthonic position, she actually serves a dharmic role. So she
Mhm.
serves at both a cosmological and ontological function to sort of destroy matter, which is considered to be prone to decay.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and it's really interesting, really interesting. The Platonic tradition has this as well. It's the psyche cosmou, the soul of the world, which is the paradigm, right? Or we might say archetype, prototype even of the human soul. And we call it psyche cosmou, the soul of the cosmos. And that is what actually becomes the womb and the feminine principle in the Neoplatonic tradition. But you got to remember the monad in the one in Platonic tradition is both male and female. The dyad is the separation of the two. And that begins the sequence of even and odd numbers, which we call Plato's lambda, right? On the even side, moving down the left, you have 1, 2, 4, and 8. And then on the odd side, moving down the right, you have 1, 3, 9, and 27. And so the left side is what we would consider feminine, the even side, and then the odd side is the masculine. But in the one, they're united, right? Because it's everything. Everything's in the one. And then what we have is I'm not going to go into too much crazy abstract Platonic and Pythagorean jargon. Some people might be being like, wait, you've already, what? You're not, you're already there, but it gets hairier. I'm not going to go into that, but the soul falls. Yes. Like you're saying, it descends. It is placed into, it is imbued with the harmonies that are latent within the one and then given to the cosmos. And this is the order that creates relationship, attraction, reversion, or aversion, repulsion, these kinds of simplistic things that sort of fractalize and compound on themselves into more complex kinds of life, right? Everything starts very simply and everything becomes quite sophisticated. Everything also obviously subject to decay and transformation, death physically. So there's quite an interesting parallel there, because the soul being abstracted from the one, the soul of the cosmos, does ultimately desire reunion. So yeah, there is an eros there, which becomes there's much more of an imperative in the paradigm or the reflection of that cosmic soul in the human soul. And it's really by we have that in Kabbalism too, right? It becomes Nehushtan. Nehushtan is the serpent of wisdom, that sort of chthonic, like you were saying, aspect that has to wind its way back up the tree. Now, that's Kabbalistic. In the Platonic and Hermetic verbiage, so interesting. You say aggregations, their term is accretions, talking about the same thing. The soul is feminine in any person, really, according to this worldview. It's right. They mythopoetically referred to it as kori, maiden. Like the virginal girl is the soul. Now, in its transmigration, which they called metempsychosis, in its transmigration of birth, death, reincarnation, and again, this is a mythopoetic analogy. It descends into the phenomenal cosmos with a tutelary spirit or a psychopomp called the daimon. Okay. And it descends down through the planetary spheres. And as it enters, right, we're talking about the classical traditional worldview, this going full circle back to the astrological component. It meets with Saturn, and it meets with Jupiter, and it meets with Mars and the sun and Venus and Mercury and the moon, until finally being embodied in the earth, the sublunary realm. While on the way down, according to Porphyry was the earliest, I think, to really talk about this in a text called On What Is Up to Us, about free will and determinism. It's adopted by later Neoplatonists like Proclus. These accretions are added to it. So we talked about earlier, right? The Hebrew letters. I said the 7 doubles. So these 7 planets have a dual nature. And these are conceived of, again, as masculine and feminine, not gendered in terms of what we would understand as all the connotations that automatically, the baggage that comes with having to speak in gendered terms because of, different human biases, but more pre-essential versions of gender. And these are conceived of as a vice and a virtue, something that impels one towards the physical and something that impels one towards the supra physical, the supra cosmic. And at each one of these planetary spheres, the soul puts on a vice and a virtue. And he also refers to these poetically, Porphyry, as the starry garments. And the entire theurgic process, as Proclus later puts it, is to cast off these garments. And he Proclus makes a comparison to the Odyssey, when Odysseus finally arrives back home in Ithaca. He has to go dressed as a beggar, and when he's ready to slay the usurpers, the suitors, the people that have courted his wife unwillingly and consumed his resources, he tears off his rags and he stands naked. And Proclus says, mortals who understand the body alone cannot obtain things divine. Only those who are stripped of their garments may attain the summit. So, I mean, we're talking even the languaging is extremely close, which I find completely fascinating because I don't know Tantra.
No, this is why I wanted to be in dialogue with you, Ike, because I knew you would instantly pick up on like many of these conceptual ideas. This is exactly why I started podcasting. This is exactly how I started podcasting, was listening to people talk about Egyptian stories or like different systems of magic that I wasn't familiar with, had never read anything about, and hearing the similarity and like seeing, oh, okay, there are even etymological parallels, like you were talking about, like aggregations or accretions. Well, isn't it interesting that even the word in the New Testament is scandalon, and in Buddhism, tantric Buddhism, a skanda is an aggregation. That's an aggregation of the mind, but it can also refer to the sun. So it has like a direct Christological sort of connection right there. Scandalon is, as you probably know, is a Greek and Sanskrit compound word. Well, that's really interesting. Why did they compound those two languages that have such a huge vocabulary and have the ability to create new words within them, even dependent on context? Sanskrit does, at least. So I'll speak for the thing I'm familiar with, but you can create new Sanskrit words very easily through compounding as long as you follow the rules. So it's a very alchemical language in that way. But it's interesting that they would alchemize Greek and Sanskrit together, and then it would find its way in the New Testament. And then what does it mean? Well, every Hebrew Kabbalist would know that it means a fetter of the mind, or a trap. But it can also mean a key. And maybe that's more of an inner or secret meaning. And so this is exactly how we conceptualize it in Tantra. It's a key or a kila. And I don't know if like Greg has ever showed you his peg collection, but like this is a idea that it's the true magician's implement for Tantra. It's like a 3-sided peg, but it can also be described as a tent pole. So that's kind of interesting if you're thinking about like how we're moving from into like a Aries Neptune era, because obviously the Hierophant, like you could say the Hebrew letter represents a tent peg, and which I'm forgetting the name of because I'm nervous a little, but I apologize. But no, I think the languages, I think we're speaking very similar things. I think there are disagreements, like infinity and eternity. We would say that an eternalist, I'm not saying this against you, Ike.
No, I know, I understand.
I'm
dialogue is disagreement. I prefer disagreement a lot of times.
Okay. Well, okay. So in the spirit of that, as a Buddhist, we would say that eternalism is an extremist view. And we would say infinite because you have the infinite capacity for Hesed, or infinite capacity for loving kindness. And you can even see like there is so much Kabbalistic sort of translation And it was taking place for a long time, because if you're looking at like the oldest, specifically like Mahayana and Tantric Buddhism, those scholars were all Jewish. So they were clearly seeing certain kinds of overlap, and like we call it bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is actually much more related to the idea of Gevra and Gedula, like those two things in tension and synthesis together, because it's about discrimination and wisdom as well as loving kindness. So it's like the ability to like discern when you're going to apply force in the world. So it's much more middle. Obviously, Buddhism even calls itself like a middle path practice. Even Tantra, you're supposed to like rectify and synthesize in the middle path. And all of our deities occur on either a moon disk, so very yasodic, or a sun disk, very tiferatic. And those actually have very distinct and different meanings. And so I know you and I disagree on this point about Rahu Ketu and like the sort of like the 7 traditional luminaries, but you were talking about the serpent figure. So for Buddhism, he is a deity. Like Rahula becomes a one figure. Interestingly, the two become one. So his dualism becomes resolved, sort of in and of himself, sort of, and he becomes a deity. He becomes the deity of the eclipse of space, and he becomes the sort of, you could say he's considered to be the evil host, who is the god of all the hosts of the planets and the stars, the evil hosts. So the shadow, maybe the liminal hosts. And so all those like little demons and goblins, that's when he's depicted. They all follow him around because they're really him. That's how we think of it in Tantra. They're really his aggregations. They're really his like bullshit and his like desires and all that stuff. But I think fundamentally we're talking about something very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, because the thing is that the serpent is always going to have the dual aspect to it, right? The same serpent that can kill you with the venom can heal it. It's just about this idea of being raised up off of the ground. In the rod of Asclepius representing health, right? It's a staff with a serpent twined around it. The caduceus, the staff, which is big in the Western mysteries, the staff of Hermes, is 2 serpents winding upward around this middle pillar. Nehushtan, the serpent of wisdom, or the serpent of brass. Originally, it's Kabbalistic, but originally comes from Exodus, when the staff of Aaron is placed in the ground, and there's a snake wound up it that heals the nation. People, the Hebrew people were dying of a sickness or snake bites, and they wound this snake up a staff, and all the people were healed, and the death stopped. So there's this positive negative. It just has to be raised. Now, in the Egyptian system, yeah, I mean, there's lots of serpent deities, but the big one is Apep, which is made. It's the Greek version of it is more noticeable, I think, is Apophis. Okay, so in Egypt that was Apep, and he was the underworld serpent that every night in the 12 gates of night, at the nadir of creation, as the sun set and went under the earth into the underworld, Ra and his entourage of deities, including Set, right? Set is not usually considered a hero deity in Egyptian mythology. He's the one who becomes jealous of his brother Osiris and tears him into pieces. But they bring Set on board because every night, all of these gods have to beat back Apep, the massive serpent. And when the sun rises, and just as it's about to come over the horizon of the 12th gate of night, Apep is defeated and bound, right? And this is the origin of the saying, saved in the 11th hour, because he's defeated he's faced in the 10th hour of night. He's defeated in the 11th, and at the 12th hour is the completion where the sun rises up over the horizon again, and all the entourage of deity says, "Yay, guys, we saved creation from the snake of oblivion." so yeah, I mean, it's and why the question you got to ask yourself is why is everything so similar? And I think there's a twofold reason. I think it's because they had less. I'll put it this way, actually. Nature was an analog. It was a composite, an analog of spiritual principles. Everything in nature did not show you what the spiritual principle was the way I might show you, like, hey, look at my new beard or my haircut or something like that. Look at my new shirt. But there was something behind it, that there was a pattern to its nature. There was this pattern, this cyclical nature. What did it do? Okay, what this thing does will tell you what the spiritual principle underlying it is. And so I think that was what was immediately available to them in the ancient world, right? Nowadays, we got to make an effort to go outside. But at one point in the world, you had to make an effort to find shelter. So you're always out in nature, in the elements and things of that sort. And so I think that they were able to use those analogies because that was what was immediately available to them. And on the other hand, of course, as I'm positing in my upcoming book, which is called Esoteric Mythology, that's coming out with Inner Traditions this November, I talk about in order to synthesize these symbols and put them into some coherent mythological framework that allows them to suggest something or express spiritual, formula like we're talking about, you got to use the image making faculty that makes these connections and can see, in the eye of the mind. We call it the imaginal, right? A la Henry Corbin, right? Not the imagination. Talking about the same thing, different context or different connotation. Imagination is something. It's bunkum. It's garbage. It's just kind of like your subconscious trying to express itself in daydreams and things like that. That's not what we mean. Yes, there is that component, that creative component, that active component to the imagination. But as the imaginal, it is an organ of spiritual perception. So what is not apparent to the physical eyes becomes translated through the eye of the mind, which is the image-making faculty of your imagination, which we call the imaginal. So I think it's a combination of those two things, is the things, the material phenomena and cycles that were available to them immediately and just, the most present, that had the most presence to their day-to-day existence and accessibility. And then on the other hand, it was this kind of exalted image-making faculty that was allowing them to pull these pieces together and receive these spiritual paradigms and put them into myths.
Oh, I agree with you. I think this has been sort of my project broadly, maybe not specifically my show as of late, but certainly when I started, the first thing, I didn't want to do any kind of like influencer. I just totally wanted to do this as a magical project. Just being honest, I've talked about it before, so it's not really a big deal. But I did a series on the Mahavijja, which is a grouping of 10 goddesses. So dakinis are actually described as empty. Like you were saying, like sometimes the Neoplatonic would describe like the sort of feminine force, not necessarily as inverted, but just empty. So obviously I said emptiness is something. I agree with that view, is that it's luminous and massless. So just like how we would say in Hebrew Kabbalah, like women are more sephirotic because they have a womb. So they have like an empty space. It's not necessarily a negation of them at all. I know you weren't saying that.
The purpose of that space is to be filled with life. So it's very important.
Right, exactly. So I wasn't saying that you were saying that. I was just wanted to clarify for me. I wasn't trying to say that either. But so I did a comparison with the Hebrew tree, and because I had seen other left-hand path people do a sort of pseudo comparison, and it didn't make sense because the Mahavijja, the grouping of 10 specifically, they represent all densities. Like you could say that just one sort of like understanding, like however deep you go in it, like if you go all the way in it, that you are going to hit Parda's lair, meaning Diamond Thunder or Rigpa or whatever you want to call it. But so you can't just say, oh, like because this school preferences Kali or this school preferences, well, they only did Kali. That's the only ones I ever could hear about or see. And I knew that was wrong because, so you might have a disagreement about this, but this is why I'm bringing it up. is because we do not say that time is the first cause, excuse me. Time for us is not first cause. She is the prime mover, but she is not first cause. First cause is actually Tara, green Tara, like Buddhist green Tara, because she is pregnant with potential. It's called Lambodharaya. Just like you were saying, it's emptiness filled with the space of like potential, like very Hasidic in a way. And she is the mother of the milk ocean, right? She is the perception, the witness to the spiral of the universe moving forward, at least in her perception, right? But then she's also, because it's Buddhism, she is a star who self-combusts. So even though we prefer a dyad, like you would see a deity, and almost always 99% of the time they will have a consort, in general, you can say some of the cosmic Buddhas, they don't necessarily need a consort, simply because it can also be their breath, right? Like this is a very, like, I'm sure you're very familiar with this concept. So if they're breathing into reality, that can also be the consort. That's more at a Dzogchen layer. I do not practice Dzogchen. I definitely see it more as real and not real. Like the deities are real, but they're also sort of generations of my own mind, and how they contain the like different tantric layers of meaning. But so I don't really take them as like necessarily celestial beings, but I think the principles are there. And so a lot of what we do in the group spaces, the Gray Lodge, is talk about this exact thing that you and I are doing. Like we are doing comparative sort of cosmology or comparative mythology or comparative magic even. And so I tried to bring it what I thought was the aeonic concept of this aeon. So I posited that we're moving out of Kali Yuga. I'm not the only one. A lot of people who study tantric astrology agree. And so I said, okay, well, it's the aeon of the daughter. We're going to call it that. And then we'll do like a sort of Kabbalistic comparison and see what, like all the, I'm not a Telemite. I don't know anything about Telema really, except for the stuff that I've studied in the last 2 years. And so I just was like, I'm going to offer my personal rectification of where I thought they went wrong. So that's basically what we did. So it's a very speculative exercise, but I think you're exactly right. It's like, if we can't be in dialogue about these things, then we cannot expand the limits of what contemporary thinking on magic is. But then also things remain in silos. And while I agree that people need like lineage and transmission and all of that is important, I'm not eschewing that at all. But I have to just be honest that like, the institutional, I'm not criticizing anyone's practices or religion in any way. I'm comfortable in many frameworks, but I'll just say that in my opinion, the institutions have not maintained the best relationship with inner and secret tradition knowledge, in my opinion, at least in relationship to the public.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it becomes a game of power and control. And it's what I find even in the initiatory traditions is, and it very well may have been the case for much longer than I've been aware of it, right? But there's just this horrible job at half-assing what you're doing a lot of the times. And I think a lot of that comes from, if I had to guess, if I had to interpret it, I would say that a lot of that comes from, this kind of egalitarianism that inhibits people from having to apply themselves to the fullest degree. And we get a lot of slack, the modern, it doesn't even matter if it's an educational institution, whatever it is. I mean, like anything that's for a profit kind of has this weird HR culture that is kind of this installed framework. It's like like a fucking alien attaching itself to the brain of a human, and being like, those words are inappropriate, and it's what it's trying to do there is it's trying to influence consumer satisfaction, customer service. I don't think customer service should apply one fucking iota to your education. It's not about what you want. It's not about what you think is going on and how you want to be coddled and patted and delivered a certain amount of information. This makes people fucking lazy. It makes people lazy. You get the grade even if you didn't do the work a lot of the times. Not all the time. And I have a lot of experience. I've been to every kind of higher educational institution you can go to. I've been to trade school, community college, private university, state university. I've done a whole tour of this. And I see that a lot, it just kind of bleeds out into the world where nobody's going to hold your ass to the fire. And I find that doing stuff like this, joining the Golden Dawn is not a fucking extracurricular. It's not like the rules of normal society need not apply to this. And that you must strive, right? We have a saying in the Golden Dawn ritual, in one of the rituals, they who will not strive will not attain. And so it's what you find a lot of people that kind of get the grade, and they're it's like, yeah, but is this for real? And that, I think, happens in the institutions as well. I think it's even more insidious with the larger institutions, because the people who get to the top of those egregores, the people who get to the top usually are the ones who are willing to do the most cutthroat, borderline psychopathic things, right? When money and power and control is at play, those systems, you need to, an egregore, once it becomes sufficiently large, has one goal: to sustain itself. Even if it's supposed to be a religion, even if it's supposed to be charitable, when an egregore becomes like corporate, becomes a big thing, it has one goal: self-preservation, and by any means. And that's what we see happening. It's not just capitalism. It'll happen in any form of fucking government. It's the egregore. The egregore becomes so big, all it wants to do is just feed itself and stay alive. And so it will defer to the laws of nature, which is, might makes right in nature. People who ride that system to the top are usually the least qualified to be there when it's something like esotericism, and I'm not saying that at all about any particular order, but certainly things like the Catholic Church, certainly things like certain of these Islamic power structures that are repressive, and you can name a lot of them: governments, police departments, all of this stuff. It just becomes inherent and endemic to the field of just institutional growth. So I don't know, a little bit of a political tirade, but it all relates, because we occupy the same spaces as these institutions. It doesn't matter how much magic I do, how much prayer I do, how many times a month I offer mass. I still, I'm still here rendering unto Caesar. So there does have, I think it's an important thing for people to hear too, this idea that if you're going to get involved in these traditions, you got to go balls to the wall. It's not about being comfortable and getting the sash and getting the robe and getting the pat on the head or what we call passes, right? It's about actually doing the inner work. And don't be one of those people who just wants to ride to the top. For all your listeners, anybody that's interested in this stuff, maybe they're on the fence thinking about getting involved, this is not an extracurricular. And so don't expect the same level of HR culture, do the work. And I think that is the way that we will prevent this institutional lapse, this absconic, we don't care about the teaching. We don't care. What we care about is, the tithes and the gold leaf on the fucking wall. That's what we care about. And being able to put this guy out here with a funny hat and have him say something in the square with a bunch of cameras on him. And now all of a sudden, millions of people on the world are singing that tune. That's something that's entirely different from the stuff that we do, I think.
I just say a lot. And I actually got this from reading Michael Aquino, funnily enough, not because I took his work as being like, oh, I'm so interested in this. I wasn't really that interested in his work. I was more just like, I want to see what this is about. a lot of those, the crystal tablets, there's 12 of them. I've only read 6, whatever ones are in public. I'm sorry to all the Setian bros listening. I've read them. But it's legalese. He's using Lurianic Kabbalah. That's how I understood the text right away. He's using Lurianic Kabbalah to create treaty relationships that you cannot break out of. It is inherently the klipas. It's inherently kapothic. But I'm applying it to all of the NGO stuff, all of the institutional stuff. That is all inherently klipas. Now, those aren't inherently evil, but they are most subject to decay through time, especially, and space. So the reality is like, yes, I agree with you 100%. It is turned into something like a totally different beast altogether, all of that stuff. So I'm not like saying like, oh, I'm like you. I'm like, let's just put our heads down. Let's work. Let's do the hard yards of sadhana. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it. When I started podcasting, I was like 2 to 3 hours a day sadhana. Then there became a place where I was like 30-minute little catch-up practices here and there, which I'm not calling you out in any way, but I'm just sure you're familiar with, because that happens when you're busy. It just does. And you don't prioritize it. And then so now I'm kind of coming back to a place where I'm really hitting it. So I can 101 million% feel the difference, experience the difference, and just like, for me, I don't need the ritual component as much as like someone who is more invested in those systems, simply because I'm okay working autonomously now. But I like that you said that about how after COVID for me sort of like pushed me to be highly self-reliant in my own marga. That doesn't mean I eschew teachings or teachers. It just pushed me to be very self-reflexive in how I practice and what I'm practicing. And if it's actually taking me somewhere, or if I'm making an excuse, because both of those things, as I'm sure you've heard other people talk about, oh, I don't want to do this ritual. I don't like doing this. They'll make every excuse in the book. I've done that to myself. I'd be like, oh, I'm not good at it. I just can't do it. It's not hitting it for me. I don't feel the vibe. But sometimes you have to put all that bullshit aside and say, yeah, that's my own mind bullshit, and you just like do it. So I'm in the camp that you're in, Ike. This is a time of doing. I think it's an aeon of like really working at it and not being laissez-faire.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the point of self-reliance. I think having a teacher or a mentor is just somebody. I mean, I have always thought early on, I thought, okay, you get a mentor, you get a teacher, and they're kind of your Sherpa up the holy mountain, so to speak, right? Here's the thing. It's actually not like that. What it is they're teaching you on the ground a lot of times and teaching you skills. Let's put it analogically, right? Let's mythologize a little bit. They're teaching you how to identify and find medicinal plants, how to build a shelter and keep warm, how to, use your gear so that you're climbing safely, et cetera, so on and so forth. They can exhaust you with all these preparations and then ultimately send you off to climb the mountain yourself. With everything I gave you, you must now be self-reliant. You have to put all of that to good use and muster the courage, muster the will, muster the motivation. That is a self-generated process. If it's exogenous, it's not, your why isn't strong enough, and you will fail. So, nobody can pull you up the tree of life. It's like you get the tools, and then you must be self-reliant. And I do agree with you about the COVID, post-COVID world. It's, we moved onto a fucking homestead, and we grow our own food and all that kind of stuff. So that certainly was a big moment, but the beginnings of that happened with initiation for me. It's that I understand, like, the Golden Dawn is not something where somebody's up your ass all the time. You go to meetings once a month. When you're ready, you go and you ask to test. When I was coming up, there were no reviews and this kind of, it's just like, here's the information. When you have it memorized, come back. And then it's not, multiple choice fill in, I mean, essay answers to these questions, paragraphs of this kind of stuff. And you had to learn that on your own. You had to do the ritual on your own. Get it right. I remember, the first month I did the lesser ritual of the pentagram, I was facing the wrong direction. I had oriented the ritual backwards, and I'm like, God damn it. And a lot of people there would have been frustrated. They would have said, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. Or this is, a lot of people actually wouldn't blame themselves. They'd of course blame the system, because most people are too weak mentally a lot of times to take accountability. Yeah, I fucked this up. When you say, it's too difficult, why do I got to do this anyway? Just take ownership of the fact that, and turn it around. Start from the beginning, turn it around. These kinds of attitudes really, for me, began to develop because I did not have them inherently. I was a very lazy person. I would even say I was a cowardly person before initiation. So, these things, this self-reliance, this determination, really, it started once I first initiated the Golden Dawn system, and then it's just come in handy since then, especially in the world that like we live in and that we're moving towards.
Everything you said, Ike, I'm on board with. I've always been extremely impressed with you. I've always been I've always told you that, and Jamie, and like your whole cohort of people that you associate with. I'm always been in awe of like the amount of knowledge that you have, as well as like those qualities, which I think are very Aeonic qualities. I'm just speaking very plainly. I think, yes, like there are other kinds of ways you could articulate that, say like Junger's anarch. That's a sort of a perfect magician's archetype anyway, because he is a very self-reliant person, but he's not outside the law, but he's definitely discerning, discriminating, and he's not like about supporting stupidity either. So he's very, he's a man who owns himself or governs himself. So I think that is very much a magician or occultist or sorcerer. I'm just going to say that, but I agree with you. So I also have, we call it in Buddhism, aspiration. So obviously we try and do it through bodhicitta framework, meaning like you have to aspire for the whole world too. And so I do that, but I also know that like the first aspiration really is like the arrow that takes you, sort of single pointed will, that is your trajectory through the tree upwards. So I identify with everything that you said, and I hope that we all can like move forward into, if you want to call it a new aeon, in dialogue, and not be like, I think it's I just think it's American Aeon. I think that people make of that what they want and will of it. And I don't think that magic is for every single person, absolutely, or manifestation or any of that, but it is out there. So the reality is there's sort of no recontaining that. And I don't know if the chaos magicians were to blame for that or not, but it is something that we will have to deal with on the landscape. So I think that framing things in a post-magical way and saying psychic, it's not about reifying that like new age bullshit on YouTube or any of that, but I think it gives people like a linguistic tool, analogical, as you said. I like code. So it gives that analogical tool that they can actually like sort of perceive reality within a not fixed state. So they don't have to be like, oh, this is a ghost. No, it's psychic phenomena. So you're saying that, yeah, part of it, at least part of it, is in control in your own mind, at least partly.
Yeah, and it gives people, it's good because you have more control when you are less committed to the very strict definition of things. I think it can be helpful. The only time a strict definition of something can be helpful is when it's given to someone who understands, okay, I'm going to use this in this context, but I'll be willing to cast it aside at a moment's notice, right? For more openness. So, but there's not many people that can do that in the modern age. At least I have not been lucky enough to meet many people. I mean, I've certainly met some, but not many. And so, yeah, I think that's a good, that could certainly, be very helpful potentially to people in not succumbing to this overcommitment. Like you use the term reifying these concepts that leads to superstition, and you can't afford to become a superstitious person when you begin acknowledging the reality of this stuff, because It'll overwhelm you. You'll become paranoid, and you'll become convinced. You'll become convinced of your own ideation and things like that. And then those are all counterproductive. Those are all accretions. Those are all, you know, the aggregation, the accumulation.
Trying to mot max. That's all I can say. I think it's a Aeon Mott. I've used that framework as well. I've used the Gnostic one. I've used the Tantric one, and I try and be flexible. I mean, I'm not a chaos magician so much anymore, but definitely as a kid, I mean, that's what kids of the 90s were reading. It just is what it is. And so I try and use those tools, not necessarily for anti-cosmic purposes, but simply for like theurgical, like applying conceptual tools to my pre-existing tantric framework, which is very similar. And so you can see that even the ideas of like changing cosmology, yeah, you change cosmology if you change texts. You might change deities. You might, and like you're not, and like as I said, we don't believe in like a deity isn't quite the same thing. So you might be changing your entire worldview from like one practice to another, and you have to be flexible enough to do that. So I try and bring that to what I do. But I think you do a great job on that. I'm really excited. Like, I'm not going to be a Mason. I'm just a total like loner mage cell on my mountain. But Ike, I think you do. I legit. I think you do a great job in like promoting American Masonry and the Golden Dawn to like the younger generation. And I hope that you see the fruits of that. And I hope you continue doing that, because I think it's great. You're just not going to capture me because I'm like a little wild and free. But that's me, right? But I hope we can stay in dialogue, and like when your book comes out, I'd love to have you back on. And of course, I want you to plug all your stuff in your show, which I listen to. So I obviously think it's a great show, and I always enjoy roundtabling with you on Rejects. And yeah, thank you so much, Ike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And you know, I can appreciate the autonomy that you want to maintain. Doing things in a group, particularly magically or initiatically, it's a tremendous obligation, literally and figuratively. So I get it. You know, my point is not necessarily to draw people into Masonry. My point is to contextualize it within its proper framework, which is the root ground of Western esotericism as we receive it in the 21st century, only to inspire the present brethren to wake up and stop being convinced that it's a dinner club and a charitable organization exclusively, and it's based on strictly on just this kind of 1950s American morality. So that's usually why I'll talk. There's a strict rule, at least in American Masonry. You cannot solicit. You cannot go out there and promote Masonry. But so what I try and do is trying to wake up the people that are already there, because it's not like the Golden Dawn in Freemasonry. You have a lot to contend with in the way of people that are in this organization that really do. Some of them do not have a spiritual bone in their body, which is quite interesting. But anyway, thank you for the kind words. Thank you for the excellent conversation. Thank you for bringing me on. I will utilize that opportunity to plug some of my stuff. One of the things I didn't mention in the beginning is that I am an author, and I have 2 books that you can buy currently. One is called A Formless Fire, Rediscovering the Magical Traditions of the West. That is
best occult book, according to Brother Greg. So I've been reading it. I'm not finished reading it, because I read like 20 things at the same time. But no, so I just want to say it has been shouted out on this show at least twice.
Wow. That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's so that's out there. You can get it. I wrote also Etheric Magic. You can get that. That's a whole system of kind of this energy work where I bridged Eastern systems of Qigong and Meridian theory and brought them into magical, Western magical paradigm via the Kabbalistic tree of life and the verbiage and analogies of alchemy. I've got that book coming out this year with Inner Traditions called Esoteric Mythology. And for anybody that wants to check out my podcast and YouTube channel, it's Arcanvm, as I have it spelled here, ARCANVM. And you can get all of my stuff, all updates, my podcasts, my videos, my blog, everything is on ikebaker.com, IKEBAKER.com. There's a little chat widget in the bottom right corner. If you want to ask questions, you want to make contact within reason, reach out to me there. It goes to my personal inbox, and, be nice. That's all.
Well, thank you so much, Ike. And I did not mean to imply that you promoted American Masonry. Let me just clarify, just for people listening, I did not mean it like that. I just simply meant that you represent it very well on stage, especially in comparison to many of those other IG podcasters who are maybe or maybe not Masons. It's never quite clear themselves, but will promote a kind of idea of Masons that is very, I think, incorrect. And so I appreciate that you have come to shine clarity on what American Masonry not only is, but should be. So let me just clarify what I said. Thank you so much, Ike.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on. This was fun.